Our next videos are going to be covering senses because these are tied to your nervous system. They are what is providing information and data to your nervous system, both your peripheral and your central nervous system. We're going to be talking about things like vision, sound, balance, touch, those sort of senses. But no matter which one we're talking about, they all actually work in a similar pattern. So let's look at how they all kind of work, and then we'll talk about the specialties in each of the different senses. So all of the senses are going to start with a sensory receptor cell. So it's going to be some sort of cell that's going to gather information that's tied to that area of the body. There are two different options for this sensory receptor cell. Some of them we'll see are straight nerve endings, dendrites of a neuron. So, for example, we'll see some of our touch receptors are actually the dendrites, the endings of neurons. Or in something like your ears, we have specialized cells that are the receptor cells that are called hair cells. Those are then attached into the neurons. So those hair cells are going to do their job and then pass the information on to the neurons. A lot of them we'll see are actually straight neurons that are gathering the information, but we'll see for a few of them there are actually specialized cells before we get to a neuron. Those receptor cells are going to respond to a minimum threshold of stimulus. So think about, for example, touch, right? Not everything that touches you is something that you're going to feel. Now, our sense of touch is pretty good, but it's not the same all over your body. And so, for example, your face is generally going to be much more sensitive to touch, and so you'll feel a lighter touch up on your face. These ones are going to have a much lower minimum threshold, the receptor cells up here, than, say, the back of your hand, right? So it's going to take a little more stimulus to get that minimum threshold to fire the receptor cells in the back of your hand than it would on your face. Those receptor cells, once they hit their minimum threshold of stimulation, are going to pass the signal to neurons if they're not a neuron. So if they are a neuron, they're then going to continue to pass the signal to other neurons. And that signal is going to get passed through the peripheral nervous system. So if it's on, say, your finger, you're going to pass that through your peripheral nervous system until you hit the central nervous system at the spinal cord. Then it'll travel through the spinal cord to the brain. Once it hits the brain is going to translate that signal as sight, sound, smell, balance, whatever it is that the sensor receptors are in charge of. All right? And so all of the senses that we're going to be talking about work in this same way. So they start with that sensor receptor cell. That receptor cell is going to respond to a minimum threshold of stimulation. Once it hits that minimum threshold, then it's going to start to send the signal through neurons in the peripheral system. That will reach the central nervous system, aka the spinal cord, and then that will be sent to the brain. You'll see that as far as the central nervous system, there are a couple of them that actually don't have to go to the spinal cord. For example, your eyes and your ears, those guys are able to travel straight to the brain because they're wired straight in since you're right there. So we do have a few things that are slightly different, but they are still traveling to part of the central nervous system. They just don't have to go through the whole system. Let's take a look then at our first sense, which is vision. So we're going to take a look here at our eyeball. So we have our eye. Obviously, this is the organ for the sense of vision. And we're going to walk our way through how this is going to work. We've got light, and that's obviously what vision is going to be based on. It's going to enter through the cornea. So the cornea is this outer covering. It's kind of tough. Then that light is going to pass through the pupil. So the pupil is this opening right here. And you're probably well aware that your pupil, in humans at least, can contract and expand. And it can contract and expand so that you can gather different amounts of light. So we talked in a previous video about the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions of your nervous system. And if you're going to have your sympathetic nervous system fire, it's going to expand your pupils so that you can gather the largest amount of light possible. All right, so we've got light that's coming in through the cornea. It's going to go through the pupil. We're going to keep going. The next part it's going to travel through is the lens. And in humans, the lens is not hard. It's actually squishy. And this is because if you look at it right here, there are little tiny muscles attached to the lens so that our eye can pull and squish to actually focus that lens, just like you'd focus a lens in a camera. So our eye is actually going to focus that lens. And that lens is going to focus the light on the retina, the back side of the eye. So this lens does work kind of like a camera or a projector to put that light onto the retina at the back of the eye. Now the retina itself is a pretty cool part of the eye. It's a pretty cool set of tissues. There's a lot going on back here. You can see that there is an optic nerve that runs the entire section of the retina, but it's also covered in light-sensitive cells. They come in two types. We've got rods and we've got cones. And so we're going to take a little bit of a closer look here in a second on what makes a rod and what makes a cone. Those light-sensitive cells are going to get the signals and send them from the light that hits them when the light gets focused on the retina. And they send those signals to the optic nerve. So we just talked about senses. So we've got sensory receptor cells. So the sensory receptor cells for your vision are these rods and cones. And then they're going to send that information to the optic nerve. So that's the neuron. And so that is going to go straight, the optic nerve goes straight to the occipital lobe back in the back and gets translated into visual information for us. So let's take a look at these rods and cones. So here is the section of the retina. So we've got light coming in. Sorry. The light is going to come in down here, and you're actually going to pass through some other cells before you even get to the lights, to the rods and cones. And then the rods and cones are right here, and then you've got the tissue at the back of the retina. You might be able to now guess why they're called rods and cones. It does have to do with their shape. So let's talk a little bit more in detail about rods and cones. And so here you can actually see the real, rods and cones, what they look like, and they really are rod-shaped and cone-shaped. So they are those types of shapes as what we've shown in, drawings and so forth. So these two sensory cells make up 70% of your sense receptor cells. Think about that. 70% of your sense receptor cells in your body are rods and cones. So what does that tell you about vision for humans? It's pretty important, right? So these rods and cones are incredibly important and send us tons of information on a constant basis. So let's see what each of these do. So rods are going to be very, very sensitive to light. These are going to tell you basically what the light level is around you. They can't tell you what color it is, but they can tell you, is it really bright? Is it, really dim? These are the ones that you're going to use. For example, if you get up in the middle of the night, I'm sure you've all experienced that, and you get up and everything looks black and white and gray, right? No color, because you don't probably have, if you don't have lights on, you get all black and white and gray. And that's because you're using just your rods. But they're insanely sensitive to that light. And so that's why you can, with that very little light in the room, you can see things and, make your way around objects, because these rods are going to be able to help you out as far as seeing. So like I said, black, white, and grays only. Cones, on the other hand, these are the ones that can detect colors. And so that's why in that other picture you saw that there was a red one, there's a green one. There are also blue detecting ones. So they aren't actually red, green, and blue, as you can see in the picture up here. But when we say that there are three types of cones, red, green, and blue, what we mean is red light detecting, green light detecting, and blue light detecting. So these cones are collecting the sections of the light spectrum around the red wavelengths, around the green wavelengths, or around the blue wavelengths. And like we talked about back in the light lectures, this is why you just need red, blue, and green in order to see white light. Right? Now, this isn't true necessarily for other organisms. There are other organisms that have more cones than we do. So for example, mantis shrimp, if you're not familiar with them, look them up. They're very cool. But mantis shrimp have more cones than we do, which means they can actually see more colors than we can. They can see colors that we can't really imagine because they have more capabilities of those cones being able to be put together in different combinations. The cones, though, also allow us to see fine details. So if you think about rods, when you're up in the middle of the night, you can see, but things are fuzzy. They're not clear. Versus when you have light and, it's daylight, you can see colors and everything is clear and crisp. Unless you have bad vision like myself and you haven't been able to find your glasses. But these guys are going to give you that fine, fine detail. Now, I'm sure some of you have hit your eye, bumped your eye, something like that, and you see like that flash of light, but you know that there's no light there. Your eye was closed when you got hit. This is because when you get hit in the eye, or even if you get hit in the back of the head when your eyes are closed, you still see that flash of light. That's because that impact, that jarring, actually fires these guys as an impulse. So they all fire, their action potentials go off, and they send a signal to your brain saying, hey, we see something, even though they're not seeing anything. And so just something like an impact to your rods and cones will fire them off, and you'll see light, even though there's not actually any light there. All right, I'll pick up in the next video talking more about vision because there's tons to talk about with it since it is such an important part of our senses.